Imagine this, you're standing in a church, surrounded by your loved ones, paying respects to someone you lost too soon. It's a time of grief, a time for healing. But then, in the blink of an eye, everything changes. It begins with John Hornezes, a young man with a bright future that was cruelly cut short. He grew up on the city's north side, a part of town where tension often ran high. He was known by his friends and family for his bright smile, his easygoing personality, and his caring nature. His parents, his brothers, his cousins, they all came together, each of them holding on to one another for support as they prepared to say goodbye. John's parents, a mother and father who had seen both joy and hardship, leaned on their faith and their love for each other during their son's passing. His siblings, though young, showed great strength in dealing with the loss. Pittsburgh's North Side was already a hotbed of violence, with long-standing feuds between rival groups that had led to countless shootings and deaths. John, tragically, had been caught in the crossfire of one of these feuds. Though many hoped that his death might serve as a wake-up call, some believed retaliation was inevitable. And as the family stood outside, paying their final respects, those fears came true. They leaned on one another, too, finding comfort in the shared pain of losing John. No one could have ever predicted that their already unimaginable grief would be compounded with yet another attack, this time, an attack during the most sacred of all ceremonies. Despite the pain, they came together with the hope that they could, in some small way, find peace. The Hornezes family was gathered at Destiny of Faith Church in Pittsburgh's Brighton Heights neighborhood, preparing for the funeral service of their beloved John. The church, a place of healing, was chosen by the family because it offered them solace during a time of unbearable pain. There had been whispers on the streets about retaliation for the previous shootings. In a split second, the shots rang out. Rapid, relentless. 6 people were struck by gunfire, with one person suffering critical injuries. The carnage unfolded in mere seconds, and as quickly as it began, it was over. But the damage had already been done. Was this what led to the attack? Was this a planned act of revenge? Or was it something more? We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is that the events of that day would send shockwaves through the entire city. But what no one knew, what no one could have ever guessed, was that as they gathered to remember John, danger was closing in. It was meant to be a day of mourning, a day to honor the life of a son, a brother, a friend. But as we will see, it became something far more horrific. His mother, who raised him as a single parent, remembers John as a hardworking young man with big dreams. Despite the challenges they faced living in a tough neighborhood, John's life was filled with moments of joy and hope. He had plans to pursue a career in music and hoped to use his talents to escape the cycle of violence that claimed so many of his peers. And from there, the path leads to the devastating attack on his family and the community that loved him. Like many others, he fell victim to the violence that plagued his neighborhood. On October 15, 2022, John found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time when a gun battle erupted outside a Sunoco gas station on Pittsburgh's North Side. 3 lives were taken that day, John's included, leaving behind a family devastated beyond words. In the following moments, we'll take you back to where it all started, to the streets where John lived, and to the gun violence that consumed his life. The devastating loss of John Hornezes Jr. will leave you asking not just why it happened, but how we can stop it from happening again. A gunshot rings out, followed by another, and then the chaos erupts. People scatter in all directions, screams fill the air, and suddenly, the funeral you attended to mourn your loved one becomes the very site of violence you never imagined could happen. This is the story of John Hornezes, a young man whose funeral was turned into a nightmare. A family already grappling with the loss of their son was forced to confront an act of violence that no one could have predicted. Who would do such a thing? And why? The answers lie within this tragic case, and today we'll take you through every heart-wrenching detail. On October 15, 2022, 20-year-old John James Hornezes Jr. was shot and killed in a gunfight that took place outside a gas station in Pittsburgh's North Side. The shooting was the result of a violent, ongoing feud that had escalated beyond control. His death sent shockwaves through his family and the local community. Just 13 days later, his family gathered at Destiny of Faith Church in Brighton Heights, hoping to find some peace and closure at his funeral. But what was supposed to be a somber, respectful moment, quickly transformed into a horrific scene of violence. 6 people were injured, and the very foundation of the Hornezes family's grief was shattered by yet another act of gun violence. This wasn't just another crime in the city, this was a tragedy that struck at the heart of a community already dealing with unbearable pain. A family's funeral, a sacred space, is something no one expects to be marred by violence. Yet on that fateful day, the Hornezes family found themselves caught in the crosshairs of an attack that left everyone questioning, who would target a family already mourning the loss of their child? What could possibly justify the carnage that unfolded just feet from John's casket? The story begins long before the shots rang out at that church. John James Hornezes Jr. was a 20-year-old from Pittsburgh, a city with a complicated relationship to gun violence. But the streets of Pittsburgh were not kind to John, nor were they kind to his family. John's funeral was set for October 28, 2022. The grief was still raw. The Hornezes family had always been close-knit. For them, family was everything. The morning of October 28, 2022, started as any other. Just days before John's funeral, tensions in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. The shooter, whose identity was still shrouded in mystery at this point, had been waiting for his moment. As the mourners gathered outside, as the casket was prepared for its final journey, a vehicle slowly crept down the street, its windows rolled down. Inside the church, those who had been paying their respects rushed to secure the doors. Outside, the street was chaos. People fled in all directions, many not even fully understanding what was happening. The Hornezes family, already reeling from the loss of their son, now faced the incomprehensible horror of being victims in a violent act at their own son's funeral. Sean Davis, 19, and a 16-year-old minor, were taken into custody, charged with attempted homicide, aggravated assault, and firearms violations. Davis was no stranger to the authorities, he had a history with the law. The questions that loomed large: was this simply a case of retaliation? Or did it run deeper than that? His ambitions weren't much different from those of any young person. He wanted to make it out of the streets, pursue a career in music, and one day be able to provide for his family in a way his parents had always hoped for him. But also the overwhelming task of trying to find closure after such a violent tragedy. It wasn't just about blood, it was about love, trust, and loyalty. Maria had always stressed the importance of family. She taught her children that no matter what happened outside of their home, they always had each other to lean on. John's siblings were all close in age, and though there were disagreements, like most siblings, the bond they shared was undeniable. Together, they navigated the complexities of life in a neighborhood where things could go wrong at any moment. Despite their struggles, there was an underlying sense of unity that kept them strong. Maria and her late husband, who had passed away several years before, had worked hard to provide for their children, ensuring that they were never without love or support. The grief was heavy on everyone's shoulders, but what no one could have foreseen was the tragedy that was about to unfold on the day of John Hornezes' funeral itself. He was a talented musician, playing the guitar and writing his own songs, which gave him a sense of purpose and a creative outlet. But the harsh reality of his surroundings was ever present, and like so many young people in the area, John found himself pulled into the cycle of violence that had long dominated the North Side. It wasn't just John they had lost anymore, it was their very sense of safety, too. A gun battle broke out between rival groups, and in a senseless act of violence, John's life was taken. His mother, Maria, described her son as the light of her life, someone who brought joy into their home even on the darkest days. His siblings, older and younger, looked up to him as a protector and a guide. And for his friends, John was the person they turned to for advice, comfort, or just a laugh when life got tough. He was a young man full of potential, whose life was unfairly cut short. Though John's life was taken too soon, his legacy lived on through the people who loved him. His family, especially his mother, who had raised him with love and determination, struggled to make sense of the loss. Maria never imagined that her son, the one she had raised to be kind and compassionate, would become another victim of gun violence in a city that had seen too many like him fall. He was just 20 years old. The circumstances surrounding his death were not an accident, they were the result of escalating tensions between local factions, each with their own grievances and vendettas. John, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, found himself a casualty of a feud he had no part in starting. The aftermath of the shooting was immediate. Police flooded the area, and investigators worked tirelessly to piece together what had just happened. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings was quickly obtained, revealing a group of individuals in the car involved in the attack. Their faces hidden, their motives still unclear. What was known was that the shooting was no random act of violence, it was targeted. But targeted at whom? And why? Investigators confirmed that the gun used in the shooting was the same weapon tied to a previous homicide just months earlier. It was a chilling connection that added layers of complexity to the case. But even with the arrests, many in the community still didn't feel closure. The idea that the violence was so brazenly carried out during a funeral left many wondering if justice would truly be served. 2 suspects were arrested shortly after the attack. The investigation quickly revealed troubling links to previous acts of violence in the area, further complicating the case. John Hornezes Jr. was born and raised on Pittsburgh's North Side, an area known for its deep history and cultural significance, but also marked by the challenges that come with living in a neighborhood plagued by violence and poverty. From a young age, John seemed to stand out among his peers. He had a vibrant spirit, a love for life, and a big heart. His mother, Maria, always remembered him as a boy with a gentle soul, someone who would go out of his way to help others, even if it meant putting his own needs aside. John was known for his smile, bright, contagious, and full of warmth. To those who knew him, it was clear that he was destined for something greater than the rough environment that surrounded him. Despite the hardships that came with growing up in a neighborhood that saw its fair share of crime, John dreamed of something better. On October 15, 2022, John was tragically caught in the middle of a violent confrontation outside a Sunoco gas station on Pittsburgh's North Side. John's death wasn't just a tragic loss for his family, it was a devastating blow to the entire community. As the family prepared for John's funeral, they were forced to confront not only the emotional weight of their loss, the Hornezes family, like many, was a tight-knit group. They lived for one another. John's funeral was meant to be a moment for the family to reflect, to mourn, and to begin healing. But for those who knew them best, the gravity of the day hit them hard. The church, which had always been a source of comfort and support for the family, was meant to be a sanctuary that day. But as they gathered together, as they waited for the service to begin, there was a palpable sense of unease hanging in the air. While no one could have predicted the horrors that were about to unfold, the fear that it could happen at any moment was real. But there was no denying the emotional toll it took. Little did they know that what should have been a peaceful solemn occasion was about to be shattered by violence yet again. It wasn't just the loss of John they would have to come to terms with, it was the brutal reality that their pain was far from over. The next chapter of their lives was about to unfold in the most tragic and unexpected way. Beside her, John's siblings sat quietly, their faces marked by sorrow. For them, this was not just the funeral of their brother, it was the painful beginning of an irreparable void. It was difficult to focus on anything but the gaping hole left by John's absence. He had grown up in the same rough neighborhood as John, and it didn't take long for him to fall in with the wrong crowd. Though the details of his past remain murky, it is clear that Davis had been involved in numerous criminal activities long before the funeral shooting. He had run-ins with the law, and by the time of John's funeral, his reputation in the neighborhood was already clouded by allegations of violence and intimidation. His life had been marked by struggles with authority, constant legal battles, and a growing sense of anger toward the system he felt had failed him. The grief was consuming, and the idea that they would have to say goodbye to him forever was more than any of them could bear. His involvement in a string of shootings in the area had escalated in recent months. John, tragically, had become a part of that violence. It is believed that the feud between Davis and the Hornezes family stemmed from a dispute over territory, with underlying tensions between rival groups in the area. These kinds of feuds were nothing new to the north side of Pittsburgh. The violence had been brewing for some time. The gang tensions, the turf wars, and the cycle of retaliation, these elements had all contributed to the toxic atmosphere that surrounded John Hess' life, and ultimately, his death. Despite this, they remained close-knit, leaning on one another for support, trying to maintain the strength to honor their son and brother with dignity. The funeral was a time for reflection, a time to gather the pieces of their broken hearts and try to make sense of the loss. In moments like this, the weight of grief is almost unbearable. The church was decorated simply, a few flowers resting atop John's casket, the air heavy with incense and sadness. The priest had just begun his eulogy, speaking softly about John's life, his character, and his promise as a young man when the sound of distant tires on gravel could be heard outside the church. It was faint at first, a hum in the distance, but then, in an instant, it would be drowned out by something much louder, something much darker. It was a strange kind of grief, one that was heavy, unyielding, and forever etched in their hearts. It happened so quickly, so violently, that those in attendance barely had time to react. The sounds of gunshots rang through the air, shattering the peace, the sorrow, and the fragile sense of safety that the family had been clinging to. Screams followed, confusion and panic spread, and within seconds, the somber gathering turned into pure chaos. The Hornezes family, already devastated by their loss, now found themselves thrust into a nightmare they could never have imagined. The church stood as a quiet sanctuary in a city rocked by violence. What drove them to target this grieving family, at a moment when they were already at their most vulnerable? To understand that, we need to look into the history behind the shooting, who was the person behind the trigger, and what was the motivation for such a horrific attack. The air was thick with the kind of grief that only a mother, a father, or a sibling can understand, a quiet sorrow that filled every corner of the building. Outside, the sun had just begun to shine through the heavy clouds, but the family felt none of the warmth. It was a day for mourning, for saying goodbye, for finding a moment of peace in the middle of their unimaginable pain. Each of them was broken in their own way, and the funeral was meant to be a step toward healing. The church, usually a place of comfort and solace, was filled with soft murmurs of friends and family members, all gathering to pay their respects. The mourners were dressed in black, their faces solemn, their eyes red from crying. Some had just arrived, others had been present since the early hours, but all shared the same feeling, a deep, aching sense of loss that nothing could ever fully erase. For the Hornezes family, it was supposed to be a time to honor John's life, to reflect on the young man he was and the dreams he once had. It was supposed to be a time to mourn him in peace. But as fate would have it, the events that would transpire at that funeral would leave the family reeling once again. Pittsburgh's North Side had been the scene of escalating violence for years, and no one was immune to its reach. John's siblings, who were already devastated by his untimely passing, now had to prepare for yet another blow, one they could never have expected. Maria, too, was struggling to find a sense of peace. She knew she had to be strong for her family, but deep down, her heart was broken in ways words couldn't describe. The loss of her son was a wound that no time would heal. The funeral itself was held at the Destiny of Faith Church in Brighton Heights. Maria, John's mother, had been trying to hold it together. The last few weeks had been a blur of grief, memories, and unanswered questions. His younger brother, who had always looked up to him, struggled to understand how the world could be so unfair. His sister, who shared countless memories of growing up together, was trying to come to terms with the fact that her big brother, her protector, was gone. For them, the funeral wasn't just about the loss of a loved one, it was the start of a new, painful chapter of their lives. Her friends and family rallied around her, offering support, but nothing could fill the void left by John's absence. As she stood at the front of the church, her heart heavy with the pain of losing her son, she tried to push aside the fear that something else might go wrong. No mother should ever have to bury her child, and yet Maria found herself in that unimaginable position. John's siblings, too, felt the weight of the loss in their own ways. In the days leading up to the funeral, the Hornezes family tried to hold on to one another, to lean on the strength of their unity. As the family gathered to say their final goodbyes to John as the soft strains of the church organ filled the air, it was a cool autumn morning on October 28, 2022, when the Hornezes family gathered at the Destiny of Faith Church in Pittsburgh's Brighton Heights neighborhood. The service was planned to be intimate, a private moment for the Hornezes family and those closest to John. Maria Hornezes stood at the front of the church, her hand clenched tightly around a tissue, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. As the priest spoke, the shooting would begin. But what was it that drove someone to commit such an act during a time when a family needed peace the most? The shooter's name was Sean Davis, a 19-year-old from Pittsburgh. But Sean was no stranger to trouble. Davis had been linked to several previous violent incidents. In fact, But the connection between Davis and John was not just one of rivalry. Some in the community believed that Davis had personal grievances against the Hornezes family, though the full extent of these conflicts was not immediately clear. Whether the attack was purely about revenge or if it was a more opportunistic act during a vulnerable moment remains a point of debate. The pain of losing John was one thing, but being attacked at his funeral added another layer of trauma that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The service was underway at the Destiny of Faith Church, and the mourners were just beginning to gather around John's casket outside, preparing to lay him to rest. As it approached the group gathered outside the church, the car came to a stop. Maria Hornezes, still holding on to the image of her son in her mind, was one of the first to react. It wasn't clear if there was more than one person involved or whether this was a lone attack, but the violence was relentless. Those outside had no way of knowing when it would end, and there was no telling how many had already been hit. The only thing certain was that the funeral had been transformed into a battleground, one that no one had prepared for. After a few agonizing minutes, the shooting stopped. The vehicle had already sped away, leaving behind a scene of devastation. But the impact of the attack had only just begun to sink in. The immediate aftermath was a chaotic blur. Witnesses and survivors were left trying to comprehend what had just happened, their minds struggling to process the horror they had just witnessed. Law enforcement arrived on the scene within minutes. Officers flooded the area, securing the crime scene and helping to evacuate those who were still in danger. The police quickly began searching for the suspects, scanning for any potential leads. For the Hornezes family, though, the damage had already been done. Their grief had now been compounded by the trauma of the shooting. When the dust finally settled, the extent of the injuries became clear. 6 people were hit by gunfire. One of them, an older relative of John's, was critically injured, and initially, it seemed as though they may not survive. The others had sustained non-life-threatening injuries, but each of them was left shaken by the violence they had just endured. Blood had been spilled, not just from the bullets, but from the emotional wounds that would never heal. Among the injured was John's father, a man who had already lost his son in the most tragic of circumstances. His wounds weren't immediately visible, but the emotional toll on him was immense. How could he now face the unimaginable tragedy of losing his son and being attacked at the very moment when he should have been able to mourn? His family had to hold him together as they all struggled to process what had just occurred. As first responders arrived at the scene, their presence was a crucial factor in bringing some semblance of order to the chaos. Paramedics worked quickly, attending to the injured and providing the necessary medical attention to stop the bleeding and stabilize the victims. The fact that the situation didn't result in more deaths was a testament to the quick response of law enforcement and emergency services who risked their own safety to ensure that those who were still alive had a chance to survive. For the survivors of the attack, the trauma of the day would follow them long after the gunfire had stopped. Many of them were left in shock, struggling to comprehend the violent reality they had just experienced. Some would later seek counseling to deal with the emotional scars left by that day. The physical injuries were painful, but it was the mental toll that would prove harder to heal. She collapsed in panic, her body shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what was happening set in. Her other children, already reeling from the death of their brother, had to brace themselves for yet another trauma, this time, a violent attack that seemed to come from nowhere. Inside the church, those who had been attending the service scrambled to lock doors and barricade themselves as quickly as they could. In the madness, people could barely hear one another over the gunfire and the sounds of people running, trying to escape the shooting. The once sacred space had now become a zone of pure chaos, its walls echoing with the terror of the moment. And then, in an instant, the sound of gunfire shattered the calm. A burst of rapid fire rang out, echoing down the street, cutting through the somber atmosphere of the funeral. It wasn't a single shot, or even a few, it was a relentless barrage, loud and deafening. Those standing by the casket and those near the church's entrance could hardly react in time. In mere seconds, the peaceful setting turned into a scene of terror. Chaos immediately erupted. People screamed and scattered, diving for cover behind trees, vehicles, or anything that could shield them from the barrage of bullets. A few brave souls rushed toward the source of the gunfire, attempting to confront the attackers or shield the vulnerable. But in the confusion, most could only run, with no clear understanding of where the danger was coming from or when it would end. The church, a place meant for reflection, for comfort, was about to become the scene of something unspeakably horrific. As family and friends stood around, attempting to hold themselves together amidst their sorrow, the air was pierced by the sound of a vehicle approaching. At first, the hum of the car engine seemed distant, almost insignificant, but it quickly grew louder, and with it, the unmistakable sense that something was wrong. The shooting was an act of violence that not only shattered a family but also left an indelible scar on the community. It was a stark reminder of the senselessness of violence and the toll it takes on those who are caught in its path. What was known was that Davis had access to weapons, an alarming sign of the escalating nature of his violence. He had been involved in previous shootings, and his behavior seemed to be spiraling out of control. But what pushed him over the edge on that fateful day? Was it just another round of retaliation, or was there something deeper at play? One of the more chilling aspects of the shooting was the cold calculation behind it. Investigators would later reveal that Davis had scoped out the location ahead of time. He knew that John's funeral would be taking place at the church, and he had timed his attack with precision. Armed with a firearm, Davis didn't hesitate. He aimed and fired indiscriminately at the mourners, not caring who he hurt, as long as he made his point. In that moment, the humanity of the family, their grief, their loss, all of it was disregarded, sacrificed for the sake of whatever message he believed he was sending. In the weeks following the shooting, authorities would uncover more details about Davis's state of mind leading up to the attack. Mental health professionals and law enforcement would suggest that Davis had been struggling with a host of issues, including emotional instability and anger management problems. He had been living in a world where violence was a constant presence, where retaliation was normalized, and where peace was nowhere to be found. Some say he had become desensitized to human life, seeing it as expendable. Others claim that he had simply lost all control, overwhelmed by the bitterness and rage that had been building up inside him for years. Davis's arrest and subsequent charges would bring some sense of justice, but for the Hornezes family, the damage was done. It was a moment of unbearable grief for the Hornezes family. The vehicle was creeping slowly down the street, too slowly for anyone to think it was just a passing car. The Hornezes family, already in the midst of their grief, found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The shooter, or shooters, were still firing as they moved through the area. The aftermath of the shooting was felt not only by the Hornezes family but by the entire community. Witnesses who had been present at the scene shared their accounts, each one haunted by the images of people running for their lives, children in tears, and families scrambling to find each other amid the madness. Pittsburgh law enforcement flooded the area within minutes of receiving the emergency call. Officers ushered them to safety, guiding them away from the scene of the attack, and offering them the comfort of shelter from the chaos. Some had managed to get a glimpse of the vehicle from which the gunshots had come, while others recalled seeing a figure running toward the car before it sped off. The shooting was targeted, and Davis, a known figure in local gang activity, had direct connections to the Hornezes family's situation. Investigators learned that Davis had a history of violent behavior and was known to be involved in multiple previous shootings in the area. Law enforcement learned that in the weeks leading up to the shooting, Davis had become increasingly agitated and unpredictable. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment attack, it was a deliberate act, meant to escalate the violence and send a message to his rivals. In several of his social media posts, he had alluded to his ability to escape any consequences for his actions. His behavior suggested that he felt untouchable, a dangerous mindset that often accompanies individuals deeply entrenched in violent lifestyles. The Hornezes family, already devastated by John's death, was forced to relive the horror of that day in the courtroom. It became clear that the emotional toll of this attack was far greater than any of them could have imagined. The shooting had robbed them not only of their son but of the opportunity to mourn him in peace. The emotional toll on the Hornezes family was immeasurable. Losing a loved one, especially a child, is a pain that many parents hope to never experience. His younger brother, who had always looked up to John as a protector, now found himself facing a future without the guidance and support his brother had provided. The loss of his sibling left him feeling adrift and unsure of how to move forward. John's sister, who shared a bond of closeness with her brother, was left in a constant state of grief, unable to reconcile the violent nature of his death with the joyful memories of their childhood. The emotional scars on these young people were profound, and they too had to cope with the trauma of not just losing a brother but being thrust into the chaos of a shooting at a moment that should have been reserved for remembrance. But to lose a child in such a violent and public manner, and to then be attacked during the very funeral meant to honor them, is an agony few could even imagine. Maria Hornezes, John's mother, struggled to make sense of the events that had unfolded. The grief of losing her son, compounded by the horror of the shooting, was overwhelming. She described feeling numb, almost detached from reality, as if the events of that day were a nightmare she couldn't wake from. It was as though a part of her had been permanently torn away, and no amount of time or reflection could fill that gaping hole. Every day since the shooting, Maria has been forced to grapple with the painful reality that her son's life had been stolen not just by violence but by an act of senseless hatred that also robbed her of the peace she so desperately sought. For John's father, the emotional weight was just as crushing. In the wake of his son's death, John's father found himself lost in a sea of grief and guilt. Survivor's guilt was something he couldn't escape. He kept asking himself why he was still here when his son was gone. The case of the Hornezes family serves as a stark reminder of the senseless violence that continues to plague communities across the country and the devastating impact it has on those who are left behind. Davis's mindset, shaped by years of exposure to violence, had led him to the conclusion that violence was the only way to resolve disputes. The shooting wasn't about justice or personal grievance anymore, it had become about power and control, fueled by years of tension and hatred. Davis, arrested shortly after the attack, was charged with multiple offenses, including first-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, and weapons violations. The charges were a direct result of the violence that unfolded that day, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The jury convicted him of multiple charges, including first-degree murder and attempted murder. The sentencing hearing was equally emotional, as members of the Hornezes family spoke about the profound impact the loss of John, and the violence at his funeral, had on their lives. Maria Hornezes, fighting through her tears, described the pain of losing a son and then being forced to watch as the very place meant for his peaceful farewell became a sight of terror. The court sentenced Davis to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though the damage done to the Hornezes family could never be undone. At his arraignment, Davis's defense attorney argued that he had acted in a moment of rage, citing his troubled upbringing and struggles with mental health as mitigating factors. The defense contended that Davis had not intended to kill anyone, but rather, had been overwhelmed by the circumstances surrounding the ongoing gang conflict. However, the prosecution pushed back, emphasizing the calculated nature of the attack and the fact that Davis had targeted an entire family during their moment of mourning, a fact that weighed heavily in the case. Friends and family of Davis later came forward, revealing that he had exhibited signs of emotional instability, including violent outbursts and erratic behavior. Some even suggested that Davis may have been using drugs or alcohol in the lead-up to the attack, which could have exacerbated his decision-making abilities. As they delved deeper into his background, they uncovered a web of escalating violence and unresolved grievances, which had led him to this moment. This initial testimony was invaluable, but it was the surveillance footage that would truly start to piece together the puzzle. The church had security cameras situated on the exterior, and nearby businesses also had cameras trained on the street. Tensions had been mounting between groups in the area for some time, and John's death had served as a catalyst for retaliation. Davis, who had ties to one of the factions, saw the funeral as an opportunity to send a message. It wasn't just about targeting the mourners, it was a statement, a continuation of the feud that had already cost multiple lives. These cameras had captured the moments leading up to the attack. Video footage from a store across the street showed a white sedan slowly cruising down the road, stopping just short of the mourners. The connection to earlier crimes helped law enforcement narrow down their suspect list, and soon, the name of 19-year-old Sean Davis was mentioned. The Hornezes family, still in shock, was relocated to a nearby safe space while authorities began the painstaking work of securing the evidence necessary to unravel what had just happened. Officers quickly secured the crime scene, setting up a perimeter to ensure that no one else was in danger and that critical evidence would not be disturbed. The church, which had just been the site of a horrific act of violence, became a focal point for investigators. Crime scene units were dispatched immediately to collect evidence, while paramedics continued to treat the injured in the aftermath. Many who had come to the funeral to pay their respects to John now found themselves witnessing violence that they would never forget. The shooting at the funeral left Pittsburgh's North Side once again grappling with its painful legacy of violence. It was a city where gunfire had too often become a part of daily life. But never before had it struck so deeply, so painfully, in the middle of a moment meant to be sacred. The question now was, how would the Hornezes family recover from this? Could they ever heal from the trauma that had been inflicted on them during what should have been their son's peaceful farewell? As soon as the gunfire ceased, the police response was swift. The first priority for law enforcement was ensuring the safety of the remaining mourners and those who had not been hit by the gunfire. Investigators quickly gathered statements from witnesses who had been present at the funeral. Witness statements and the physical evidence quickly confirmed what law enforcement had suspected: this wasn't a random act of violence. Davis's motive became clearer as investigators pieced together his connections to rival factions within the North Side. But while retaliation was the most likely motive, the authorities couldn't ignore the possibility that Davis's actions had been influenced by other factors, such as mental health struggles and personal demons. However, it was also clear that Davis had made a calculated decision to act during the funeral, a place of vulnerability, because it would have the greatest impact. As investigators moved forward, they also discovered troubling evidence of Davis's growing sense of invulnerability. The legal proceedings following the attack were swift, but they would be marked by controversy and deep emotional reactions from both the Hornezes family and the local community. Throughout the trial, witnesses provided heartbreaking testimony, describing the terror they experienced during the shooting. After several months of legal proceedings, Davis's trial reached its conclusion. Though justice had been served, it was clear that for the Hornezes family, nothing could fully heal the wounds left by that day. The tragedy that unfolded on the day of John Hornezes' funeral not only shattered a family, it left deep psychological scars that would be felt for years. John's siblings, too, were deeply affected by the tragedy. Survivors' guilt ran rampant within the family. Why had they been spared when so many others had been injured? Why had they been forced to endure not just the death of John but also the terror of the shooting? News of the attack quickly spread across Pittsburgh, as well as to broader media outlets. For some, the violent tragedy at John Hornezes' funeral was just another headline in a long series of gun violence stories. But for others, especially those who knew John and the Hornezes family personally, the impact was far more personal, and the pain was deeply felt. Those who had witnessed the shooting firsthand were left with deep emotional scars. Many expressed disbelief that such an attack could take place during a funeral, a place meant for mourning, not violence. A funeral, a sacred place meant for mourning and closure, becomes the site of devastation. The feeling of safety that many of us rely on becomes fragile, almost an illusion. First, it is a harsh reminder of the need for stronger gun control and mental health support. If we are to prevent tragedies like this, we must address the root causes of violence, be it access to weapons, untreated mental health issues, or a lack of community resources. This case serves as a call for change, a call to re-examine the way we approach crime prevention and intervention in neighborhoods plagued by violence. Narrator, it also underscores the importance of supporting families who are affected by violence, especially when it happens in such a public and traumatic way. No family should have to endure what the Hornezes family did. The emotional toll on families who experience violence is immeasurable, and it's clear that more must be done to provide emotional and psychological, and in communities already struggling with violence, the loss of this sense of security can be devastating. It brings to the forefront a much larger question: how many more families will face the same fate? How many more funerals will be turned into scenes of terror? The broader implications of violence like this are far-reaching. The long-term psychological effects can be seen in the survivors, the witnesses, and the community members who have to live with the aftermath. It erodes trust, fosters fear, and deepens divides. It underscores the need for stronger intervention and community support efforts to break the cycle of violence that continues to claim lives and leave families in despair. The Hornezes family's suffering is not an isolated incident, it is part of a much larger narrative of violence in America, and it is one that we must confront head-on if we are to see any real change. It's an experience that leaves scars on an entire community, and the ripple effects of the trauma spread far beyond the immediate victims. People are left to wonder if violence can strike at a time when people are most vulnerable, when they are mourning the loss of a loved one, what other places are safe? Yet, the tragedy revealed the depths of division and violence that had taken hold of Pittsburgh's North Side. People began asking questions about what could be done to stop the cycle of retaliation, to break the patterns of gang violence that had permeated the area. Local leaders called for reform, for more community support programs, and for stronger intervention to prevent such violent outbursts. At the same time, there were those who criticized the rise in violence across Pittsburgh, pointing to the systemic issues that contributed to such incidents. Calls for greater gun control and more resources for mental health care were raised by community activists. Yet, even as these discussions began, the question remained, how can a family like the Hornezes ever heal from something like this? Despite the public reaction, it was the people closest to the family, the ones who had known John personally, who truly felt the loss. John's friends described him as a positive, easygoing young man who always made those around him feel welcome. His passing, followed by the chaos at the funeral, left them feeling helpless and angry. For them, John's death wasn't just a headline, it was the loss of a real person, someone who had meant so much in their lives. As the Hornezes family continued to grieve, they found some comfort in the outpouring of support from the local community. Though the emotional toll was immense, the family was not alone. But even in the midst of support, the weight of the tragedy lingered, and it became clear that healing would be a long and painful journey. As we reflect on the tragic events surrounding John Hornezes' funeral, it's clear that this incident wasn't just a violent attack on one family, it was a stark reminder of the deep-rooted issues facing many communities across the country. The Hornezes family's grief, compounded by the chaos at their son's funeral, is a reflection of a much larger societal problem, the normalization of violence in places where peace should reign. It is a problem that affects not only the families directly involved, but the communities that are forced to live with the repercussions of such senseless acts. Some of John's friends held vigil at the church, not only for their lost friend, but for the lost sense of safety that had once existed in their neighborhood. It wasn't just about the family's loss, it was about the loss of innocence for an entire community. Those questions remained unanswered, and the emotional consequences of that day began to unfold in ways that would change the Hornezes family forever. Many members of the community expressed shock and outrage. A funeral was supposed to be a place of peace, of mourning, and a space for closure. Yet, on that day, it had become a place of horror. For the people of Pittsburgh's North Side, the incident brought attention to the growing violence in the area, violence that had already taken far too many lives. Maria and John's surviving children, particularly the younger ones, also found themselves struggling with feelings of anger and betrayal. While the attention kept their son's death in the public eye and brought the case into the spotlight, it also forced them to relive the trauma repeatedly. The family was caught between wanting justice and wanting peace, and the constant presence of cameras and reporters added to their emotional burden. Some asked why their family had been singled out. Others questioned their safety in the neighborhood they had once called home. The mental health repercussions were overwhelming, and the family was left to try and pick up the pieces of a life that had been violently shattered. Some family members sought professional help, while others found comfort in leaning on each other for support. But the burden of grief remained heavy, unyielding, and impossible to ignore. In the wake of the shooting, the public reaction was swift, though it varied depending on the perspective one held. Local news outlets covered the shooting extensively, with reporters highlighting the details of the attack, the injuries sustained, and the investigation that followed. The media coverage was both a curse and a blessing for the Hornezes family. In the community, people were left reeling. Many who knew John were heartbroken by the senselessness of his death. The public outrage was palpable, especially when the details of the shooting emerged. Tragedies like this alter the very fabric of a community. They instill fear where there should be none. Such incidents challenge our collective sense of security. We begin to question the places we once took for granted: public spaces, community gatherings, even moments of personal vulnerability. So, what lessons can we learn from this case? Support to those who are left behind. The mental health resources available to communities struggling with trauma need to be expanded, and more proactive measures should be taken to ensure families can heal, rather than becoming further victims of violence. In terms of legal changes, the case of the Hornezes family has sparked renewed conversations about gun violence, gang activity, and public safety. In Pittsburgh, as in many other cities, there has been an increased push for stronger gun control laws. The tragedy at John Hornezes' funeral serves as a stark reminder that we must do more to protect those who are most vulnerable, especially in times of mourning and loss. The shooter, Sean Davis, a 19-year-old with ties to local gang activity, targeted the Hornezes family as part of a larger feud. They were forced to cope not only with the death of their son but also with the trauma of being victims of violence at a time of vulnerability. His sentencing served as a reminder of the devastating impact violence can have on individuals and families, but for the Hornezes family, no legal outcome could ever bring back their son or heal the wounds inflicted by that day. This case is not just a story of loss, it's a story of resilience of a community and a family who must now pick up the pieces of their broken lives. We'll keep you informed about new videos, investigations, and the ongoing conversation about how we can prevent tragedies like this in the future. While the legal proceedings may have come to a close, the emotional and psychological healing for the Hornezes family is far from over. The ripple effects of that fateful day will echo in their lives for years to come. In Pittsburgh, as in many other cities, there has been an increased push for stronger gun control laws. Local leaders have called for more stringent background checks and better enforcement of existing laws to ensure that weapons do not end up in the hands of individuals who would use them recklessly or maliciously. Additionally, there is a growing demand for programs that can provide better intervention for at-risk youth, helping to prevent them from falling into cycles of violence and retaliation. The shooter, Sean Davis, a 19-year-old with ties to local gang activity, targeted the Hornezes family as part of a larger feud. But also with the trauma of being victims of violence at a time of vulnerability. Survivors' guilt, grief, and the overwhelming weight of the tragedy left deep scars on every family member. Was it purely about gang retaliation, or was there something more at play? We'll keep you informed about new videos, investigations, and the ongoing conversation about how we can prevent tragedies like this in the future. And what is your opinion on the outcome of the trial? Do you believe justice was served? Share your thoughts in the comments below, as we continue to explore the complexities of this case and others like it. The public's reaction was one of shock, with many in the community rallying behind the family and calling for changes in how violence is addressed in their neighborhoods. The case sparked conversations about gun control, gang violence, and the need for better community intervention. The investigation uncovered critical evidence that tied Davis to the crime, including surveillance footage, witness statements, and ballistics reports that connected him to prior violent incidents. His sentencing served as a reminder of the devastating impact violence can have on individuals and families, but for the Hornezes family, no legal outcome could ever bring back their son or heal the wounds inflicted by that day. This case is not just a story of loss, it's a story of resilience, of a community and a family who must now pick up the pieces of their broken lives. While the legal proceedings may have come to a close, the emotional and psychological healing for the Hornezes family is far from over. The ripple effects of that fateful day will echo in their lives for years to come, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the far-reaching consequences of violence in our communities. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the violence wasn't just random, it was driven by a personal, ongoing conflict between rival factions. The mental health resources available to communities struggling with trauma need to be expanded. And more proactive measures should be taken to ensure families can heal, rather than becoming further victims of violence, and it serves as a powerful reminder of the far-reaching consequences of violence in our communities. Survivors' guilt, grief, and the overwhelming weight of the tragedy left deep scars on every family member. The tragedy at John Hornezes' funeral serves as a stark reminder that we must do more to protect those who are most vulnerable, especially in times of mourning and loss. If we are to stop the cycle of violence, it is essential that we not only address the symptoms but also the root causes. Until then, the fear that tragedies like this will continue to unfold will remain. The public's reaction was one of shock, with many in the community rallying behind the family and calling for changes in how violence is addressed in their neighborhoods. No amount of justice or reform can bring back their son, or erase the trauma they've endured. But their story is not one of hopelessness. It is a call to action, a reminder that as a society, we must come together to prevent future tragedies from tearing families apart. The question remains, will we listen? As we conclude the tragic story of John Hornezes and the shooting that unfolded at his funeral, let us take a moment to reflect on the key points of this devastating case. John Hornezes Jr. was a young man with a promising future, a son who was loved deeply by his family and friends. His life was violently cut short during a senseless attack, one that also left his family facing an unimaginable second blow, the attack on them at the very funeral meant to honor his life. The case sparked conversations about gun control, gang violence, and the need for better community intervention. The investigation uncovered critical evidence that tied Davis to the crime, including surveillance footage, witness statements, and ballistics reports that connected him to prior violent incidents. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the violence wasn't just random, it was driven by a personal, ongoing conflict between rival factions. If we are to stop the cycle of violence, it is essential that we not only address the symptoms but also the root causes. Until then, the fear that tragedies like this will continue to unfold will remain. Local leaders have called for more stringent background checks and better enforcement of existing laws to ensure that weapons do not end up in the hands of individuals who would use them recklessly or maliciously. What do you think motivated the shooter, Sean Davis? Was it purely about gang retaliation, or was there something more at play? And what is your opinion on the outcome of the trial? Do you believe justice was served? Share your thoughts in the comments below, as we continue to explore the complexities of this case and others like it. No amount of justice or reform can bring back their son, or erase the trauma they've endured. But their story is not one of hopelessness. It is a call to action, a reminder that as a society, we must come together to prevent future tragedies from tearing families apart. The question remains, will we listen? As we conclude the tragic story of John Hornezes and the shooting that unfolded at his funeral, let us take a moment to reflect on the key points of this devastating case. John Hornezes Jr. was a young man with a promising future, a son who was loved deeply by his family and friends. His life was violently cut short during a senseless attack, one that also left his family facing an unimaginable second blow, the attack on them at the very funeral meant to honor his life. Additionally, there is a growing demand for programs that can provide better intervention for at-risk youth, helping to prevent them from falling into cycles of violence and retaliation. While no policy or change in the law can undo the pain and suffering the Hornezes family has experienced, these efforts are crucial for preventing similar incidents in the future. In the end, the Hornezes family will never fully recover from what they have lost. The investigation into this tragic event revealed a chilling story. For the Hornezes family, the emotional toll was unimaginable. The trial that followed brought a measure of justice, with Davis being convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder and attempted murder. Now, we turn to you, our viewers. If you found this video insightful and want to stay updated on this case and similar true crime stories, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned, and stay aware. Support to those who are left behind. In terms of legal changes, the case of the Hornezes family has sparked renewed conversations about gun violence, gang activity, and public safety. While no policy or change in the law can undo the pain and suffering the Hornezes family has experienced, these efforts are crucial for preventing similar incidents in the future. In the end, the Hornezes family will never fully recover from what they have lost. The investigation into this tragic event revealed a chilling story. For the Hornezes family, the emotional toll was unimaginable. They were forced to cope not only with the death of their son, the trial that followed brought a measure of justice, with Davis being convicted of multiple charges, including first-degree murder and attempted murder. Now, we turn to you, our viewers. What do you think motivated the shooter, Sean Davis? If you found this video insightful and want to stay updated on this case and similar true crime stories, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned and stay aware.